Are you bleeding attorney's fees or worried about bleeding attorney's fees? Now, when I get clients, a lot of times they're at the very beginning and they're trying to decide where to utilize their resources best. And unfortunately, a lot of times I get people who are a few months in and they're like, oh, I've already spent this amount and I don't know how I can keep going. And I wish I'd known A, B, C, and D before I got into all this. Okay. So I'm going to try to help you recover if you're in that situation. But if you're at the beginning, good news. I'm going to give you the A, B, C, and D that that everybody wishes they had known when they started. So before we dive into this topic, let me just remind you, if you like the content and find it helpful, don't forget to hit like on this video. Also subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. And as always, please feel free to share if you know somebody going through this. And honestly, I think cost is an issue for every single person that is on this journey, in my experience, in one form or another, right? And, even if we have resources and we have money and we can afford attorneys, it's like, you don't want to just pour your life savings down a hole either, right? That's very, very frustrating. What happens a lot of times is the beginning of the case is actually kind of the easiest time, right? And it's the least complex part of the case. The end of the case, when you're trying to get things finalized and resolved, that's really the most complex part. And if your case ends up going to trial, that happens at the very end. And trial is very expensive. And the problem is that a lot of times by the time clients get to trial, they've already spent so much money that they don't have the resources to do it. And they've got to do the trial by themselves on their own. And again, a very complex proposition. So how can you avoid being in this situation? One of the things that you hear me say a lot is know your war chest. Okay. Know how much your resources are. And honestly, your resources are probably more than you think they are. They are for most people. Most people will tend to scrape and come up with it, even when they think they can't. I've seen people borrow from family, pull out of retirement accounts, pull equity out of houses, run up credit cards, all kinds of things in an effort to try to keep band-aiding the money part and moving themselves through this process. And I talked to a client recently who's like, you know what? I'm almost 10 grand in and we haven't even had our first hearing. Like, this is how fast it can go. And I think before you get that experience of being a little bit in and having gotten an invoice from the attorney and whatever, you don't realize how quickly it's going to go. The initial paperwork of like filing the petition and doing your financial documents and all of that, those are actually the easier pieces of the case. Now, I'm not saying that those are totally easy, but I'm saying they're easier, much, much easier than if you go to trial. Because then we go to trial, we're talking about legal arguments and, questioning people and putting together evidence and all kinds of more complicating factors. So you have to kind of think of this whole process as, okay, if I go to trial, how much money am I going to need for that? Versus what are my resources right now? And look, if you have enough money to pay an attorney and get yourself all the way through the whole thing, cool, no problem. I find the vast majority of people don't have that level of resources. And then again, they're blowing them all up front and then they're in trouble on the back end of this, okay? So we kind of bleed money on the front end and then on the back end, we're scrambling to figure out what to do. This same client that I was talking to, they said, the attorney told me, if we go to trial, that it's probably going to be like a 3-day trial. And it's like, okay, well, let's think about this. 8 hours of trial times 3 days is 24 hours times whatever your attorney's rate is, right? Let's say it's $400 or $500 an hour. You're looking at about 10 grand for 3 days of trial. Now, I think that's a little bit extreme, but most people are 1 or 2 days of trial. And one of the things that, my late husband, Thomas, who was an attorney, used to say is for every hour of trial, there's an hour of prep. And we don't always think of that as lay people because we don't understand what goes into, that attorney getting ready for trial. They don't just show up the morning of trial and just do your trial. They've got to do a trial brief. They've got to put together all your exhibits. They've got to submit everything to the court. They've got to come up with questions for every witness. They've got to come up with cross-examination for the other side's witnesses, right? So all of that stuff takes a lot of prep and a lot of time. So if you're looking at a day of trial, you're going to have a whole second day of just the attorney prepping, and that's probably on the low side. So for this client, 10 grand for 3 days of trial, it's like, well, that's actually probably going to be about 20 grand by the time the attorney preps. If we need that, and we already know that that's going to be a struggle, then man, if you're spending, any of that up front when you could be handling things on your own, then don't waste your resources there if that's all the resources that you have. And a lot of times in the beginning, it's a lot of communication back and forth between the two attorneys and trying to work out little issues about the child share and when the visitation is going to happen and little things like that you can negotiate yourself. Now, it's hard. You got to try to disconnect emotionally. And if you're going to negotiate with the other attorney, you got to do it professionally and kind of pull your emotions out of it and try to navigate that. But it is possible. I see clients do it all the time. And, I think this is part of the benefit also of coaching services, because what I tell people is like, think of me as like a travel guide, right? If you want to go on a cruise or you want to visit another country or whatever, why would you go through a travel agent? Because they know what the cool things to see are, right? They know all the highlights to hit. They know where to get good deals. They can give you options for packages and all that kind of stuff. And you can get to go and experience a lot more for a lot less cost than if you were trying to do all those things individually on your own, right? And I think that that's kind of how you have to look at coaching services, is that person comes alongside and they're like your guide through this whole process. Like, do I need an attorney? When do I need an attorney? How much do I have to spend? How do I navigate this? If I'm going to do it on my own in the beginning, how do I communicate with the other attorney? What kind of verbiage do I use? How do I know what my court dates are? Where can I look up information? All of that type of stuff of just where you're trying to educate yourself about what the process is and what's happening and how to handle different situations, handling your ex, how to communicate with them. All of that stuff is going to be the stuff that is eventually going to come into play at trial if you end up at trial. So you always have to kind of be conducting yourself as if ultimately that's where you might end up. But in the meantime, we're trying not to go to trial, right? If you can settle your case, if you can negotiate with the other side, or you can even negotiate pieces and then only go to trial on part of it, that saves you money. You don't have to go to trial on the whole entire case. If you can reach agreement on custody and support, but you're not in agreement on your assets and debts, well, then you can go to trial just on assets and debts. That's going to take less time than if you were going to trial on all of the issues, and then you've saved yourself the money of the trial and the money of the prep. Just knowing how to navigate these pieces can save you a lot. And again, I think the biggest mistake people make is that they don't realize until usually they're about 10 grand or so into it, 10, 15. I think that's where people start going, oh, I can't keep up with this pace. I didn't understand. And a lot of people feel like, well, my attorney hasn't done much. Well, honestly, the stuff at the beginning isn't a lot of like as much of the legal stuff most of the time. It's kind of getting the documents filed, communicating with the other side and all of that. Now, if your case starts out with a bang and you start out with a domestic violence restraining order, all right, you probably got to have an attorney right up front. But understand, a domestic violence restraining order alone is going to cost you several thousand before you even get to the divorce itself or the custody issues themselves, right? So that adds another layer of cost on there that's very, very significant. Sometimes you're in danger and you need that domestic violence restraining order, but a lot of times I see, that trying to be used to gain an advantage in custody. And if there isn't really truly serious domestic violence going on, a lot of times what happens is within a year, the effects of that domestic violence restraining order are kind of non-existent and the parties end up at a typical parenting plan anyway. So you paid an extra 5 to 10 grand on your case just to sort of delay the outcome, of the child share for maybe 6 to 12 months, something along those lines. Now, again, doesn't happen in every case. Sometimes people are being severely abused. And we've seen lots of cases. I've seen lots of cases like that. I've had women who were hospitalized. I've had women where, somebody tried to burn the house down. I've had men who were physically attacked, beaten, their houses vandalized. All kinds of stuff. You have situations where you need a domestic violence restraining order. I'm not saying that you don't, but I'm saying that you need to look at that as, do I need this, and what is the cost, and does one justify the other? If somebody's coming after you and attacking you and you're afraid they're going to kill you, then okay, we don't care what it costs, right? It's your life. But if they're kind of just, they yell and they scream and they do these things, but once you're apart, there's no, there's nothing to deal with because you're not with them. I'm not sure that's worth an extra 10 grand of your case when, in a year, you're probably going to have some form of a joint parenting plan anyway. So again, just talking through and weighing all these pros and cons. And these are good questions to ask the attorney up front. If you know to ask these things, it will help you to make those decisions. Ask them things like, how many hearings are there typically in a case? How much do you typically see it cost to get to the first hearing? When does a client's initial retainer typically run out with you? Because most of the time your initial retainer will run out around the point of the first hearing. And most people have at least 3 or 4, even in fairly simple, straightforward cases. So these are all things to ask that, it's kind of that same thing of, you don't know what you don't know. And if you have somebody who can help you know what you don't know, then you can ask those educated questions that in the long run have the potential to save you thousands and thousands of dollars and a lot of heartache. So if you'd like help with these types of strategies, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. There's information on that page about my group coaching programs for moms and for dads. And there's also information on my premium VIP one-on-one coaching services. If you're kind of at the very beginning of your case, or you do have those complexities where you have custody avowals, attorney for the children, domestic violence, those types of things going on, you're probably going to want that higher level of support. So thanks for joining me. I will see you guys next time.
We'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands.